Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Black Parents Aging. I am so just delighted to have you guys back. We are in for a real treat today. We have two very special guests that I am so excited to introduce you to. We have Emily and Mitchell Clionsky, who are both doctors who speak on dementia and have written a new book, and we are going to talk about that. So I'm going to give you guys a little information about them, and then I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to tell you about their book, kind of what the work they do, and how we can use some of the information they provide to help us with our parents. Okay. So Emily is MD. So these are professionals. They know what they're talking about. She completed her residency in internal medicine and psychiatry and is a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. Whew, that's a mouthful. She specializes in the care of patients with cognitive impairment. So that is exactly what we see in our law practice. That is exactly what a lot of the people who listen to this show are dealing with in terms of their parents. And then her husband, Mitchell, who has a PhD, is a board certified neuropsychologist who specializes in evaluating and treating patients with cognitive impairments, dementia, ADHD, and traumatic brain injury. So welcome, Mitchell and Emily.
Hi, Nicole. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for inviting us.
Real pleasure to be here.
Thank you guys so much for agreeing to come on the show. We started the show kind of as just some means to be able to get some information out. We were getting a bunch of calls to our law practice from people who had aging parents, really didn't know how to navigate this space, had not really seen any resources and didn't know what to do. And so we kind of started the show and then it's kind of evolved. And so we are so grateful that you guys are spending some time with us talking to our community about something so important as dementia. So you guys wrote a book.
We sure did.
Dementia Prevention, using your head to save your brain. Because unlike what most people believe, dementia is not inevitable. It's also not something that's purely a matter of fate or genetics, that we actually have much more control over whether or not we become demented, whether we suffer from cognitive decline, losing our ability to think, pay attention, remember new information, solve problems, all those things that go on in our brains as we get older. And so we wanted to take what we had done in our practice together and dealing with people who, in many cases, already had cognitive problems, dementia, and its precursor, which is called mild cognitive impairment. We wanted to take all that and the advice that we give people and roll it back to dealing with a much larger audience of people before they had this problem, so we could reduce the likelihood that people would get this problem.
So what I'm hearing you say is there are things we can actually do. Like we don't have to, we're not doomed. This is not our fate. Because I get a lot of times people that call us and they say, well, my mom had dementia or my grandma had dementia. And so they're already like gearing up that this is the likelihood that's going to be their reality too. So what I hear you say is we're not doomed. We're not necessarily going to have that just because our parents had that. And there's steps that we can take.
There are steps that we can take. And your perception that it's not a given, that if somebody in your family had it, that you're going to get it. That is a coming to Jesus kind of thing, though, that it tells you you really ought to be thinking about doing everything that you can to keep your brain in really good condition as early as you can start that process. Because what the research tells us is that 1 out of 2 cases of dementia in the United States can actually be prevented.
Wow.
And that's what we put in the book. Those steps that you can take at whatever age you're at.
And the fact that you talk about steps, I think, is really important because it's not one thing.
Okay.
And that's a really important concept. People constantly ask us, well, what's the one thing I can do to reduce my risk? And in most cases, it's not a single thing. It doesn't have to do with what food we ate. for most people. Certainly, if your diet is terrible and you're spending most of your time in the fast food lines, that's not good.
Okay.
But improving your diet probably won't make a great difference in your risk for dementia. So it's not just that. It's not just some new fad that comes along that you see on TikTok. It's also not any of those things that you see in the advertisements on TV in terms of special brain health foods. By and large, they do nothing except deprive you of somewhere between $50 and $60 a month.
All
So
right.
save your money or send it
Or
to
send it
us.
to us.
Send it to us. We can always do it. Buy
Okay.
the book instead. The book is half of a month's Prevagen, and it'll actually give you a whole lot more benefit, because in the book we build a model that's based on all the scientific research, which comes just not from psychiatry or neurology
Or us.
or us. We've really looked at the broad field because it comes also from cardiology, a lot of heart-related disease, comes from endocrinology, especially diabetes, which is a big issue for many people, comes in the way of exercise physiology. There's just so many different fields, and you have to sift through all of that research, examine what's real, what's substantiated, what's just somebody's opinion. Our job was to do that and then to translate it into terms and language that would be the same words we would use if you were sitting across from us in our consulting room. That's the idea, is as if we're talking to you about your health and going through what can be the things that you need to change in order to improve it.
And I got to say, I've read the book. I haven't finished it. I'll be very transparent. But I did appreciate in reading the book that it was written for just the everyday person. Like I did, I speak legal. I don't speak medical. And so I was like, oh, a book about dementia. This is going to be all these research studies and all these like statistics, and it's going to be words that I can't pronounce. But it was not that at all. I mean, it was filled with a lot of examples and illustrations, and there was a checklist. And I really appreciate. I was like, oh, this is something tangible. This is something that somebody can actually use and get some information, and then be able to take actual steps in trying to be able to make sure that they minimize their risk or their potential of having dementia. So I really enjoyed that and was like, oh, this is a real resource. So I think that that will be able to help a lot of the people that's listening to the show.
Thanks for saying that, Nicola, because that was first and foremost in our minds. And again, it comes from having talked to thousands and thousands and thousands of patients at different stages of where their brains are at. Some of them are healthy and are doing just fine. Others are already well down the path. And we, at that point, we're just trying to, stabilize them, maybe improve their cognition a little bit, and try and keep them as independent as possible.
Mm. So you just made a point, and I want to back up a little bit. So for our listeners, I read your bio, but y'all been doing this for a long time. So let's talk about a little bit your career, how we got here, how you guys now are I think, experts on dementia.
I would say so, at least by experience. I've probably tested close to 30,000 people for this condition, and there's a Guinness Book of Records on this. I'd like to be considered in the running.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
That could be a
10,000
song.
patients or
Oh,
something.
well over 10,000, probably closer to in my lifetime of 27 years as practice as a doctor, I've taken care of thousands and thousands and thousands of patients, probably on the order of close to 20,000 over the course of the last 15, 16 years.
So even though it looks like she's my daughter, she's actually my wife. And this is a marriage of love and passion, but also one of shared interests in this particular area of study, because it's fascinating how the brain works and how it influences how we feel and what we do. And so, very coincidentally, in some ways, both of us chanced upon this as what we think is really our calling. Sort of got also accelerated by my mother's developing dementia when she was in her early 70s. And so dealing with her over the course of the next 12, 13 years of her life taught me a lot of what it was like to be on the other side of the consulting table. And believe me, it's better to be on the professional than the personal end of this.
Oh, I'm sure I've had some clients who've been on that side of it, as well as guests on the show who've been on that side of it, who have really talked about how difficult it is and can be for caring for someone as they're getting.
It's also a bigger problem. Let me just say, it's also a bigger problem in the Black community than it is for Caucasians. And it's caused by a variety of factors that I think are really important. One is just the incidence of particular medical diseases, such as diabetes and hypertension, being higher. There's also, I think, a reticence to trust physicians, and a reticence for physicians in many cases who are not minority population to recognize and deal with cognitive decline early enough to make a real difference. So it's a much bigger problem, and it's complicated by growing up in areas where there's more pollution. It's complicated by food deserts where you don't get adequate nutrition. It's complicated by socioeconomic status almost as much as anything else.
And increased stressors that go all the way from prenatal all the way up through to the entire life cycle of a lot of folks in the community.
So if people aren't in a position where they can maybe necessarily change living in a food desert or some of these other factors that we know also contribute, what are some practical things that you guys have come to realize that they can do? What are some of the things that I remember seeing on that checklist? Let's talk about what can people do to really start training their brain?
Well, I think there's two really important ones, and I'm going to ask Mitch to talk about exercise to start with, and then I'm going to pick up on something that I learned really importantly when I was down practicing as a national public health doctor down in South Carolina and North Carolina, which is obstructive sleep apnea and the impact of the lack of oxygen in your brain when you sleep. Because preferentially, my patients were almost all Black, and we had the highest death rate in African American men in the United States due to cardiovascular disease, and the highest rate of amputations due to diabetes. And so when I was looking at that, I really learned from my patients that if we could treat their obstructive sleep apnea, we could really affect positively their diabetes, their heart disease, their high blood pressure, their bad cholesterol, their overweight. And those factors alone right there are all major factors that you need to change and optimize in order to prevent dementia. So the link there from obstructive sleep apnea goes through heart disease and endocrine disorders right into your brain. So Mitch, if you don't mind, could you just do the exercise piece first? Because I think that we can do that no matter where we're at.
Yeah, and I think that what happens very often is people work real hard jobs early in their life and their bodies break down. And it's hard for them to consider exercise, which they've never been really into because they didn't need to be. They worked jobs that gave them as much or more exercise than they really needed. And they get into midlife and now they can't walk without pain. They're having problems because even though they're not doing as much, they're eating as much. So now they've gained weight and they have that added burden of obesity. And so it becomes really, really difficult to get them, as well as other people, out and moving again. And they set up barriers in their own minds. I'd have to do this or I'd have to do that. So we've got a sort of simple-minded formula that really works at getting people moving. And I call it the 10 by 3 formula. You take a 10-minute walk.
Okay.
Three times a day.
I can do that.
And that's what the point is. You can do it. And you can do it even if you're really busy. You can do it even if your knees hurt. You can do it even if you don't feel motivated. You can do it if it's too hot. You can do it if it's too cold. We keep people away if it's icy. But other than that, you can do it in a lot of different places, and it doesn't require special equipment. It's nice if you have a good pair of shoes.
Right. But I think when you look at like everybody being so busy, 10 minutes, it's like, okay, you would have probably scrolled on Instagram or been on Facebook for 10 minutes. You could walk
Exactly.
That's
10
exactly
minutes.
right.
You can listen to a podcast while you're doing it. You can make a telephone call while you're doing it. There's a lot of things that you can do in that 10-minute walk, and those 10 minutes 3 times a day are additive. So you're getting now 30 minutes a day of exercise, 7 days a week, which is 210 minutes a week. That's really in the sweet spot for what all the major medical groups are recommending.
I like that. I like that it's broken down, it's practical, it's easy, doesn't require money or any real, special equipment. That's doable. Okay, that's something we can actually realistically work into our life. Okay, I
Mhm.
like that one.
And
What
you
else?
can build on it. You can build on it. That's the beautiful thing about it. Once somebody gets used to doing that 10 minutes 3 times a day, you can increase it. And I know that because I'm actually one of the laziest humans on the earth. I hate to sweat. I hate to exercise. But after listening to him for all those years, I finally realized that I'm 72 next week. I really needed about 10 years ago to get my body moving because I was putting weight on and I was taking naps in the afternoon. And I just was not feeling as good as I could have felt. And my cholesterol was inching up, and I knew I was going to get stuck on that pill, and I didn't want that pill. So I started exercising 10 minutes 3 times a day, and I'm now up to an hour to 90 minutes daily.
Very, very impressive.
And pardon me?
I said, now that's very, very impressive.
Thank you. Well, I got my weight down and I'm not on a cholesterol pill.
Mhm.
The other thing that we haven't mentioned is that many people are given medications for conditions like diabetes
Yeah.
and blood pressure, and they don't take their medication regularly. They may be concerned about side effects. For some people, it could be cost, but for other people, it's like, oh, I just don't think I need this. I don't like this idea. And so, what often happens if you're on, for example, blood pressure medicine, is that if you don't take it regularly, obviously it doesn't work. So then you go back to the doctor, and the doctor takes your blood pressure and says, it's still up. Let's increase the dose. So you still don't take it regularly. So now you go back, and the doctor says your blood pressure's still up on that dose. Let us add another medicine to this. So now you're on 2 blood pressure medicines, not taking those, and you're not noticing a difference most of the time because it's sort of a silent killer. After a while, the doctor maybe even has you on 3 medicines for your blood pressure, and man, you better not start taking them all, or you're probably going to pass out because now you're really taking things that are dropping your blood pressure. So that whole idea about getting people to reliably do something, and if they don't want to do it, to at least tell their doctor that they're not doing it, so the doctor doesn't start making all kinds of changes and think they're taking one thing when they're really not. But boy, if we could get people just to take their blood pressure medicine on a regular basis, it would really reduce cardiovascular disease as well as the brain disease.
And part of what we run into, and I'm sure you see it in your practice on a daily basis, when a family member, a son or daughter, begins to think that maybe mom or dad aren't quite thinking as sharply as they used to, and they want to get involved and help, there's that resistance from mom or dad, even over simple questions like, hey, mom, are you taking your metoprolol today? Or are you taking your metformin today? And there's that resistance from mom or dad because it's a switch of roles. All of a sudden, the child becomes the parent, and the parent feels very infantilized.
Yes, yes, yes.
And boy, that's something that's got to really be avoided. So it calls for some really good, loving communications. It's not judgmental. I always liked it when kids would come in with their parents. When I would examine them, when I would talk to the patient, though, I would be examining and talking to the person and ask the son or daughter to keep quiet until I was finished with mom or dad. Because you need to, as you do in your practice, you need to maintain that respect for the individual who is going through that experience. And
I
so,
want audience to hear that, because we are always talking about, and we always get people call in or ask about mom and dad and the healthcare side of things. They're like, well, can I go to the doctor's appointments with them? Should I go? So I am so glad that you brought that up. So for everybody that's listening, here's a doctor that says they actually appreciate when you come, so that you can be a part of this conversation and at least hear what's going on with mom and dad. But I want to bring us back kind of to the cognitive stuff, because that's what we're here for. And I heard you say exercise. I heard you say making sure we take the medications. But what are some of the other steps? And before I even let you answer that, I wanted to just get back to what you said about sleep apnea, because I found that so fascinating, without putting all his business out there. But my husband has had sleep apnea, and I have never given any thought to sleep apnea and then the relationship to maybe dementia or cognitive issues down the road. It's one of those things that you know that it's some oxygen to the brain issues going on there, but you get your CPAP and you're fine, like, as far as I'm concerned. So not thinking about maybe some long-term consequences of it, or it being a contributing factor to something else down the road. So yeah, I'm gonna have to talk to him about that.
So let's talk about obstructive sleep apnea. And I have to tell you, I didn't learn about it as a condition in either medical school class, and I didn't learn about it until my internal medicine residency, when a fellow resident named John, who was a big, big fella from Nigeria and weighed about 260 pounds at 6'4", handsome as could be, suddenly he disappeared in the middle of a rotation that he and I were on together. And no one knew what happened to John. And he was a friend of mine. It was like, I knew nothing about him. Nobody would talk. The residency director wouldn't tell us what was going on with him. The next thing I know, 6 months later, John resurfaces. And boy, is he slinky. He's still 6'4", but he dropped close to 70 pounds.
Oh,
And
wow.
he is thin and fit, and told me, guess what? I had obstructive sleep apnea. Now, this was back in 1997. And back then, they used to treat people with surgery where they would actually go in and remove the excess tissue in the throat, in the airway. And that's the procedure that he had done. We do not rely on that any longer as the primary treatment for obstructive sleep apnea. But what that lesson taught me in a real personal way with John was that when I got down to South and North Carolina, I started thinking of my patients who had all these conditions that John had, and was able to get off his blood pressure medicine, his cholesterol medicine, drop that 70 pounds, get off his diabetes medicine. I was thinking, gee, they look like John. They're on those same medications. I ought to start checking for obstructive sleep apnea. Well, a significant part of my patient population had it. When we diagnosed it and we got them treated with continuous positive airway pressure, called CPAP, these people were losing weight, were feeling better, and I actually had to start taking them off their blood pressure medicine because their blood pressure normalized. Their diabetes came under control. They were able to exercise, and their bodies metabolized food better so they could come off their cholesterol medicine. I was dealing with a lot healthier people. So when I went into my private practice, finally, after doing all this stuff in the residencies, one of the first things that I thought about was the effect of lack of oxygen in the brain, and looked at all the scientific literature published and found out that there was a direct correlation between the lack of oxygen in somebody's brain and how likely they were to develop dementia, both Alzheimer's as well as vascular dementia and other kinds. Then I married him, and he was snoring all over the place, driving me crazy. So we got Mitch evaluated and treated for obstructive sleep apnea. And then
Well, let me
after,
stop it because I get the
okay,
story.
go
So I
ahead.
go into my doctor, who's my friend, and I say to him, I need a sleep study. And he looks at me and says, well, you're not fat, and you don't.
The conception, it's like, oh, well, that's.
He says to me, I don't think you need a test. And I said, you know my wife, don't you? He says, of course. I said, I need a test. And it was, She was right. She
He
was
was right.
absolutely right. And I've been using it every night since then. That was 18 years ago.
More
That's
importantly,
good. Oh.
not only was he not fat, but when I got tested, because eventually it occurred to me, gee, I was seeing more and more women. And I was seeing women who were perimenopausal around the age of 45, 52, 55, who were having cognitive problems. They weren't remembering everything that they wanted to when they walked into the grocery store. They were falling asleep in the afternoon. They were more depressed, more emotional. So I actually got myself tested, and my primary care doctor didn't want to order the test for me because I was female, not overweight, although I was postmenopausal. I didn't have high blood pressure. So I got tested. Sure enough, I had obstructive sleep apnea. And I got a skinny neck. And I didn't fit the profile that most doctors still today believe you have to fit to be considered for obstructive sleep apnea.
Now, the good news is almost everyone who sticks with treatment reduces their level of apnea to the point where they've got normal breathing and therefore normal brains going into the future. That's the good news here. You don't need surgery. You don't need medication for this. It's one of the very few conditions that can be treated by a device that works really reliably if you use it. And that's the big sticking point, because only 40% of people who get diagnosed actually use the treatment
the way they should.
Is we need to exercise. We need to get tested, even if we may not necessarily fit the mold or fit what people would stereotypically believe are candidates for sleep apnea. And then if we are diagnosed, to go ahead and use the machine to be able to actually reduce the sleep apnea. So those are tangible things that we can do. So what's some other stuff? Like, okay, I'm without telling my age, but I'm in my 40s. What can we do?
You're a good looking 40-year-old.
So you could take a look at, there's some blood tests that we recommend that are important, but I don't want to spend a lot of time with them because most people have no idea until they get the blood tested whether or not, and our book goes into this, as does our checklist, as to what are acceptable or best levels. But a lot of the things, one of the things that we could really look at is how much we drink. Because it's easy for our alcohol consumption. It was really important during, especially the pandemic period, for people to start, they're working from home, they had access, they didn't have much else to do, but they had access to alcohol. And so we really need to take a look at how much alcohol are we consuming on a regular basis.
Another thing that somebody needs to pay attention to is how much they're smoking, how many cigarettes they're smoking, and if they have gone and resumed the 70s, 80s habit of having a joint or some marijuana, that needs to go away too.
Okay. All right. You heard it from the doctors, y'all. We got to stop drinking as much. We are post-pandemic now, so we got to put those pandemic habits away. And I know that a lot of us picked up some bad habits in the pandemic just as a result of the stress of the pandemic itself. But in terms of trying to prevent or reduce our risk of dementia, we got to get rid of those.
Right. Now, if somebody's on the younger side, let's focus in on our younger community as opposed to our older community at this point. Some of the things that would be really important is do everything that you can do to prevent traumatic brain injury. So if you're going to ride a bike or do anything that's really athletic, really protect your head, wear the seat belts without a doubt, wear the helmets when you're doing anything athletic. I didn't allow my son to play football. I wished I would have stopped my daughter playing soccer because headbutting a ball actually is enough over time to cause successive concussion problems that will eventually result in cognitive impairment. The other thing that you can do is try and keep a kid in school as long as possible, because we know that education, the more education we get in an organized, structured fashion, the better our brains will be in the long run. You, for instance, have that law degree of yours is one of the strongest protective things you could have done to control your risk of dementia.
That makes me feel awesome because my cell phones don't make me feel that way. You know, I never would have thought or made any, I haven't seen any literature about going to school longer and what that means in terms of cognitive and being able to really still have your faculties down the road. So that's a new one for me.
Cognitive reserve is what we're talking about, is building up, especially at a young age, all of those connections that later on are going to help you as you age. And the more people use their brains, and that's true throughout our lives. I mean, there's really an importance of continuing to think beyond the point of retirement. I see a lot of people who retire from life rather than just from their occupation. That's not a good thing. For many people, they haven't really prepared themselves for stopping their work lives. They don't have a lot of other things going on. So I asked them, so what do you do now that you're retired for 5 years? They say, well, I drive my wife around, or I putter, whatever that is, or I watch a lot of TV, but they always sort of look away from me when they answer the question because they realize that it's not really good, but they're not really sure what else to do. And so a lot of times it's talking about how do you marshal the resources to do different things, and maybe even how do you start planning for retirement when you're in your 40s and 50s, so it's not a shock after those first 3 weeks of sleeping in occur. Then what do I do with the next, at this point, 15 years of my life? That's a real question.
Right. The other thing to kind of keep track of and to really emphasize, particularly if you've had somebody who was more active earlier in her life and is now getting into those 60s and 70s, or maybe a dad was working a job, a couple of shifts and shift switching, that kind of thing, but now he's retired out of that. There was a lot of social interaction potentially in work that once we're not working as much, we lose that opportunity to socially interact. So it's really important to maintain close social connections. I don't care whether it's your church, whether it's a civic organization, whether it's going to the local club. I don't care what it is, but the more someone can be encouraged to actively stay social and maintain a high contact, verbally, facially, physically, the better off they are.
See, these are not things that I would normally think about or associate with helping our brain when it comes to preventing dementia. So these are really interesting and really help. These are realistic. These are things we can do.
To give you a shocker,
Mhm.
if you don't hear well, your brain will not think well. Turns out that hearing loss is a preventable cause of dementia, as well as an increased risk for depression, because people who don't hear well shy away from interpersonal relationships. They don't get the nuances of jokes. So talking to people oftentimes is less rewarding. They get sort of in their own world. But there's actually really good evidence these days that if you don't hear well, that the background sounds, which you don't even know you're missing, that bird only sings if you hear it. If you don't hear it, you're not aware that it's really singing. Well, it turns out that stimulation is important for stimulating the surface of your brain, as well as innervating the underlying network called the salience network. Salience meaning importance. So if something is important, our brains perk up, we pay attention to it, but not if we don't hear it. So these days, fortunately, getting your hearing tested is pretty widely available. Hearing aids are now cheaper and more available than they ever were, and they're better than they ever were.
And they're smaller than they were before.
I never have seen that.
So
And they look better, y'all. Let's just be honest. They look better. I never even realized she had that on.
So, we're sort of recreating ourselves. We're using our CPAP, we're exercising, we're wearing our hearing aids. If we got hearing loss, it's when you know these things, you have a hard time not wanting to do them, because nothing in there that we talk about is impossible. They're all things which are achievable if people understood them and set their minds to do them. That's the big thing, is the motivation, choosing that I'm going to change the course of my brain's future. I'm not just going to let this happen to me.
I love that. You wanted to say something else, Emily? You wanted to add to that?
Well, the other thing I wanted to bring a point to is that, a lot of times we're taking medications that have been prescribed appropriately for us. A lot of people, particularly women who have delivered their babies vaginally instead of by C-section, find that when we become peri or postmenopausal, that we have a problem with urinating or dribbling or having a bit of stress, incontinence. And so we go and tell the doctor this, and the doctor thinks she's doing a good job for us and prescribes a medication for urinary incontinence. That medication actually causes a decrease in the amount of a neurotransmitter our brains desperately need to stay intact. And so if you've got somebody who's got urinary incontinence, or even more importantly, getting up in the middle of the night to go pee, they need to be looked at for obstructive sleep apnea, because obstructive sleep apnea causes us to make urine in the middle of the night, causing our sleep to be disrupted. But also that then affects the tendency of our bodies to develop urinary incontinence during the day. And there are other ways of dealing with that urinary incontinence problem for women.
It's so crazy. It's also remembering that the body is such a system. Like, I would never think about that affecting my brain. Like, they're not related. Like, in my mind, there's no way. But that totally makes sense now that you're telling me that all of that needs to be looked at.
And some of those same medications which are prescribed have this same, what they call anticholinergic effect, that was all we also get when we can't fall asleep well. So we walked into the pharmacy, we purchased an over-the-counter non-prescription sleep aid. And the sleep aid contains a chemical called diphenhydramine, which is also better known as Benadryl. Well, Benadryl is also anticholinergic. So if you're not falling asleep well, and you're taking that, you're getting up to go to the bathroom during the middle of the night, you're taking that other medication. There are some that don't have as much of this, but some of them are really anticholinergic. Maybe you're also taking some pills to dry you up because you're allergic to things in the air. So now you could be on 2 or 3, sometimes 5 different medicines, because your doctor may also be giving you a heart medication that you need, but is anticholinergic. All of these things deplete your brain of acetylcholine, which is that chemical that Emily was referring to, that's really important for making memories. So it's one of the reasons why in our book we have a link in our book to something called the anticholinergic burden calculator, where you can plug in all of the medicines that you're either getting prescribed or taking over the counter and add up your anticholinergic burden, because it may be that there's some alternatives which are just as effective for what you really need, but don't have that as a side effect.
So how come nobody's talking about this, guys? I feel like you're telling me I have not heard any of this. I mean, I've probably taken a bunch of stuff over the counter because I don't sleep well, that I would have never known any of this is affecting or making some contribution towards my brain health. So
Because there's more money to be made in jellyfish extract. That's why.
This Prevagen crap.
This does not. No one's making any money on reducing the anticholinergic burden, is basically the bottom line answer.
But when we talk about that anticholinergic burden, those sleep medications, we're not talking about prescription. We're talking about the over-the-counter, but the prescription medications for sleep also can have the same problem. But the over-the-counters we're talking about are things that have PM behind their name, like Tylenol PM. You see that PM there, you're dealing with a class of medication that is going to cause this kind of a problem. There's a couple of other things, Nicola, that you may, especially since you're a lawyer and you do wills and you do probate work and things like this, that I think might be really important to your audience, which is if someone is in their 50s and 60s, we know that 1 out of 6 people at that age level are getting a hip replacement or a knee replacement because our bones are in bad shape. Our cartilage is crappy at that age.
Very, very
Yeah.
common. My clients are putting off appointments because they got a hip replacement coming up, or they got to try to get in here before the hip replacement. So
They
yeah,
gotta try, absolutely, they gotta try and get in and see you before they go for that hip replacement or that knee replacement. Because if they are really sharp at that point, they really need to be making some legal decisions. If they don't have a will, they ought to get one. If they don't have a power of attorney, they ought to get one. If they don't have a healthcare proxy, they sure as heck better get one. But they also ought to be looked at for obstructive sleep apnea. They ought to go through that checklist that's in our book and have those lab tests done, because we know that when people go to surgery without having their obstructive sleep apnea treated, that they are at higher risk for a bad outcome after surgery. It's called delirium. And when you develop delirium, it really can impact your cognition, significant drop within days, months, and even years after you've had that surgery.
wow.
So
Nobody
there's some,
about my surgery is also connected to my mental cognitive decline. There's nothing's in the literature, nothing's being said to say, hey, these things might have a relationship.
Well, actually, it is in the literature, but it's not in the literature that you're going to
Sure,
read.
that's what I was gonna say. It's in your literature, but the
Right.
regular people day to day, I would never have known.
And it's not even in basically the psychiatry literature. You're going to find it in.
And it's not in the family practice literature, or it's not in the internal medicine literature. It's in orthopedic surgery literature.
Anesthesiology literature, sleep medicine literature. There's a whole bunch of different places. What we've tried to do is to pull that all together because it makes for a total picture. And one of the things that you find in the area of brain function is that when you're looking in this area, there's so many different things that affect it that you have to take a really broad view or you're going to miss something that's an important piece. That's really where Emily excels, because she's the best I've ever seen at being able to synthesize this information. And so I learn a lot from her every day, some of which I remember.
Thank you, honey.
You're welcome.
I love that. Well, guys, it has been such a pleasure having you both on the show. Final words from my audience. Like, we've talked about exercise, we've talked about sleep, we've talked about looking at our medication. So what are some other things, if you want to give us kind of like a laundry list of stuff? But I'm going to tell everybody, you got to go get the book. They're not going to give you all the secrets on this show. It's only a 30-minute show. You got to get the book because they have a really detailed checklist that will be able to help you kind of figure out, okay, where you are baseline and what and things that you can do and how you can improve. All right, give us what you can, but don't give all the secrets.
Go to our website, braindoc.com. You
Okay.
can get the free download of the Dementia Prevention Checklist at braindoc.com, as well as links to about 30 other podcasts, none of which are as good as this, by the way.
You're so sweet.
But they're there and they have a lot of other information because it's too big an area. The question that you ask is a good one, but we've covered a lot of stuff today, and I don't want to dilute it by throwing something else at people.
My last bit of advice is something that I tell everybody, regardless of their age, race, gender, whatever. It doesn't matter to me. But if you're going to a doctor who is not listening to you, or if you go through our checklist and you go through the effort to complete that and say to your doctor, I want you to check this, this, and this with me, or work on this problem with me, and they are not absolutely responsive to you, please go find yourself another doctor, because there are enough decent doctors out there who are conscientious and considerate and empathetic, who will do exactly what we've got in this book, which is evidence-based medicine. And you are entitled, every person in this country is entitled to the best medical care possible.
Absolutely. I love that. Guys, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I feel a little overwhelmed. I've learned so much. Like, I'm now gonna make sure I get through the checklist. Shout out to my doctor because I have a great doctor. So I'm gonna talk to her about the checklist and we're gonna work through them. She's exactly what you said. She's been great and I feel heard and I feel seen with her. So I definitely could relate to what you just said and encourage people to make sure that they find a doctor that is also listening to them. Thank you. Thank you. I think we've all learned. I love chatting with you guys. It has been awesome. We might have to do a part two. I'm not gonna make y'all commit right now, but we might have to do a part two because I feel like there's still so much more that we can touch on from reading through the book and from just even my conversation with you guys before we started the show. There's still stuff we need to talk about.
Indeed. Love to come
Absolutely.
back.
We'd love to, and bless you for the work you're doing. Thank
Thank
you.
you. All right, guys, that's it. That's our episode. Join us again for the next one. You know how to reach us. Reach out on all our social media platforms. If you have any questions or if you want to reach out to the doctors, I will drop all their information in the show notes. I will have the information about the book and how you can purchase that as well. Until next time, thank you, guys.